Well, thank you, Michael. I'll start out by reminding you, if you have a question, you've got cards on the table with pens. Write down the question. There'll be somebody around. Raise your hand. Somebody will come around and pick up the card, and they'll get it up here to me. Let's start out by, let me introduce Matt Mackowiak. Matt is a force in Austin. He's a political consultant. He also used to be a columnist for the Washington Times, does a podcast, chairman of the Travis County GOP, and worked on, I think you sort of led the issue on the homeless in Austin when that was becoming a big issue. I remember Tom going to Austin right after we sort of got freedom in the pandemic. He said, I don't know what's happened to Austin, but I'm having to step over homeless people to try to get to the hotel. And because Matt had worked on that, we want to give Matt just a minute to sort of talk about his thoughts on it. So, Matt?
Well, thank you, buddy. And Michael, that was fantastic. Unfortunately, 12 or 13 of our major American cities are going through exactly what San Francisco's gone through. And in some cases, San Francisco followed Seattle. I don't know who went first or who went second. Austin decided in June of 2019 to pass a camping ordinance that allowed homeless people to camp anytime, any place, anywhere with almost no exceptions. And that took effect July 1st, and the consequences were immediate. And if any of you have been to Austin, particularly before May of last year, you know what you saw and what you experienced, or you heard about it from other people. I believe our homeless population between July 1 of 2019 and May of last year, over basically a 2-year period, tripled in 2 years. Totally unsustainable. And I don't need to explain why it's bad. Michael's done that, and we've all seen, if you've traveled to San Francisco or Los Angeles or Portland or Seattle or Honolulu or Chicago or New York or DC or Austin, you've seen in your own life how this has failed. So what we did is I partnered with a local Democratic activist to start a nonprofit called Save Austin Now, and we spent 2 years fighting this battle, reinstating the camping ban on the ballot in May, and in a city that is 24% Republican, won 58% to 42%. And a lot of the same attacks you get daily, I get, and my co-founder Cleo gets as well. But I think what's so vital about this is the only way we're going to take our cities back is by having courageous people in these communities lead the fight and to do it from a data standpoint, to do it from a factual standpoint, not from an emotional standpoint and not from an ideological standpoint. And that's why it was so important that we set up a nonpartisan organization with one D and one R. We don't do anything we both don't agree on. And we've had a lot of success. We have 60,000 email addresses. We've raised $4 million in 3 years. We have 1,500 volunteers. And after that success on what was called Prop B, we did try to overturn defund the police with a pretty bold proposal that failed in November. But we're not done fighting that battle either. But I'll just wrap up by saying that Michael is the perfect person to lead this fight, not just in San Francisco, but to take back our cities, because he comes from the left and has credibility and understands the left, but more so because he is courageous and because he is focused on data and on what works and what doesn't work. And for whatever reason, our country has gotten away from evaluating policies by whether they work or not. It's like, does my ideological viewpoint, like or not like this idea? And then we look at results second. Well, we should look at results first. And in Austin, it failed. Thankfully, Dallas does not have a camping ordinance. Houston doesn't have a camping ordinance. You may be dissatisfied with your homeless population here, but it is nowhere near what it's like in Austin or San Francisco or Los Angeles. I'll say one last thing. Los Angeles County has 100,000 homeless people. 60, 70,000 are in the city of Los Angeles. Austin started at 2,300 when the camping ordinance took effect July 1st of 2019. We are probably between 7,000 and 10,000 right now. The city has refused to do an independent count for 2 years. You can guess why that is. So, I'm really kind of in awe of Michael wanting to step up and try to save California, because I'm trying to save Austin as one person who lives there, and the scale of the challenge in Austin is 1/10 or 1/100th of what it is in California. So, delighted to be here and look forward to the question and answer portion.
Thank you. To highlight something you had mentioned when you talked about the person who could have gone home, but stayed out there in the drug area because of the drugs. It highlights the different mentality that I think sometimes we sort of think, aren't all these people don't they think like us in some ways and want to be able to get off? And I'm sure some do. Some are homeless because they lost a job for a little while and they're trying to get back. But for the most part, it's a drug addiction deal. And I remember an NPR story where an NPR reporter was going around with somebody who had been on Skid Row for a while, and this reporter had reported with this person, and she was going around with this person, and there had been recently a new drug that had hit the market there, and people were dying. People out there were injecting and dying. And the reporter said something along the effect of, doesn't that have your people, the people who are there with you in the drug camps, aren't you afraid about this and staying away from the drugs because of the risk of death? And he said, no, we're all trying to find that and score some of it. And this took the reporter by surprise, as you can imagine. And he said, well, no, the thinking is that this is the best stuff out there, and we all want to score some of it and have some. There's a different mentality sometimes when you've been on drugs for a while.
Yeah, that's right. We're in the worst drug epidemic in human history. That may sound like an overstatement, but it's objectively true. When I worked on drug decriminalization and harm reduction in the late 1990s. When I got out of that work in the year 2000, 17,000 people a year were dying of drug overdose deaths, illicit drug overdose deaths. Last year, 100,000 people died. It's going to be 105 or 110,000 this year. These are deaths of despair. These are deaths of people that don't have any reason to live. The only reason is to become intoxicated, to escape life. It's nihilism. And addiction. There's new books. There's a couple of big new books out on addiction. There's really not that much new or interesting about addiction. The only new thing is maybe that we now know that physically all highs come with lows. I mean, one way to look at this is that people are deeply emotionally dysregulated. That they're not doing the things, they don't have a purpose-driven life, they're not exercising, they're not affiliated with family and friends, they've lost faith in anything. But the first big opioid epidemic in the United States was after the Civil War. There was a lot of morphine around, which was used for the first time to treat soldiers wounded in battle. And it was both veterans of the Civil War and their loved ones, particularly in the South, who just started using morphine to get on with their day. And we've known for 150 years that some share of people, most people, by the way, are able to overcome their alcoholism or their addiction without an intervention. But for some share of our family and friends, an intervention is required. We have a TV show, a reality TV show called Intervention. I'm curious, people have family or friends that had struggled with substance use or addiction? Just curious, raise your hands. Usually it's about 1/3 to a half have had that experience. I have 3 friends from high school who became homeless drug addicts. 2 are dead. 1 is still struggling in Denver and Nebraska. He's itinerant. We know you have to intervene, but that's not what we're doing in cities, in progressive cities in particular. And it's the right way to think about it is a kind of left libertarianism or victimology. But the idea is that you shouldn't intervene, that people have to hit bottom. But of course, you can lower the bottom or raise the bottom. And right now, what we're doing is lowering the bottom. So when somebody is revived from an overdose in San Francisco, literally Narcan, that's now, you can put it up their nose, you don't have to inject it. They're waking up from almost dying. The EMTs then say, okay, good luck to you. And the person within minutes will go back out and use drugs. Partly because they've been Narcaned and they've lost their high and they want to get back to that. So that's insane. That's absolutely insane, but that's the existing policy. That's the moment to actually arrest the person, which is what they do in Portugal. It's what they do in the Netherlands. The big lie from the radical left is that they've just legalized all drugs in Europe and everything's fine. No, they arrest you. They mandate treatment. You can go to jail or you can go to rehab. That should be what the choice is. And the best time to do it is right when people die, is when they're close to dying. That's an existential moment. That's a chance for them to get on with their life.
Absolutely. And of course, if we're waiting until they hit bottom, the question is, when they hit bottom, are they affecting other people when they do it, right? I mean, this is one of the problems with the open camping approach, is that open camping, if it were being done in the middle of nowhere, not near transportation, not near public schools, parks, tourists, hotels, restaurants, et cetera, that might be one thing. It'd still be very bad for the people there, but it wouldn't be bad for everyone else. One of the things we've thought about is thinking about the homeless population through the lens of three separate groups. You have a group that have become suddenly homeless quickly, perhaps through no fault of their own, a medical bill, a death in the family, lost their job. If you capture those people quickly, and I say capture, it's probably the wrong word, but if you interdict quickly, you can get them back on their feet. And they want to be self-sufficient, and they can be self-sufficient pretty quickly. The second category is the one you talked a lot about, which is the drug addicted and those that are facing mental health challenges. UCLA study a couple years ago showed it was about 3/4 of the overall homeless population is either drug addicted or 3/4 has mental health challenges, and I imagine the overlap is pretty significant as well. The third group, and this is one I want to ask you about, because if Cleo, my Democratic co-founder here, she would want to ask this question. The third group is the non-compliant. You talked about enforcing the law, but it sounds crazy, but there are people out there who are choosing a lifestyle of homelessness, who are leaving shelters to go out into these open drug markets, who want to live with no rules. What do you do with the non-compliant, with people who won't obey a camping ban, with people who won't obey other rules and laws that are in effect at the local level? That, to me, is a huge question mark from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, and I should say, by the way, Matt and Cleo have done an incredible job in Austin. We're following Austin. We need to do what you did, which is to have a public camping ban. But no, I think you have the right idea, which is that we know, by the way, I didn't get into it, but the Supreme Court upheld a ruling that was created in Idaho, which says that local governments must provide shelter for the homeless in order to ban public camping. So you can't ban public camping. You can't make people, you can't kick people off of the street unless you have shelter. So even if you don't agree morally that we should shelter everybody, the Supreme Court upheld that. So we have to have sufficient shelters. Now look, if I were governor and I came in, we could do emergency orders and construct FEMA shelters. We construct temporary FEMA shelters in hours. We do so after natural disasters all the time. But the choice is you can go into shelter, you can go stay with friends and family, you can move, go somewhere else, but you can't sleep here. If you sleep here, you will be arrested. That's how it is in the Netherlands. That's how it is in Europe. In Amsterdam, in 2019, we were out late one night, 2 a.m. My female colleagues walked back to the hotel safely, having been drinking a bit, 2 a.m. The next morning at breakfast, they were angry. They were like, why can't I walk safely on the streets of San Francisco, but I can do so in Amsterdam? Well, the reason is because they don't allow open drug scenes. They don't allow drug-addicted criminals, mentally ill people to live on the streets. You can't have a civilized society and open drug scenes. They're not compatible.
So we have several questions along the lines of why do people keep electing officials, mayors and others, who don't address this? And this could be true of Austin as well, because even though you got it repealed, I think the same power structure is still in.
They are, yeah. And they're refusing to fully enforce our camping ban, which is why we're suing the city, but anyway.
What about elections? Why don't we kick them out?
Yeah, so at the end of San Francisco, this is about why progressives ruin cities, and I give 6 reasons, but then the 7th reason is this issue, which is why have conservatives and moderate Democrats failed to challenge the radical left on this issue politically? So some of it I've said, language is very powerful. So part of what my goal was for San Francisco was to write a complete book, including getting at how the radical left manipulated language. So they've been defending open drug scenes since the 1980s and calling them homeless encampments. Robin Williams, Whoopi Goldberg, Billy Crystal, you might remember, had something in the 1980s about homelessness. They were defending mentally ill and crack-addicted people to live on the streets in the name of supposedly defending the poor. So they've just been manipulating, they've been tricking your brain. I talk about homelessness as a propaganda word. So that's number one. I think the second is that conservatives, they undermined themselves, I think, by suggesting that there was no role for government at all, that this could just be solved by churches and charities. Churches and charities is the system we have now. Like, when Larry Elder ran for governor of California during last year's recall, he said we have to get churches and charities involved. Churches and charities are involved. Churches and charities win the government contracts to deal with homelessness.
Yep.
So you actually need a centralized system, and I think that conservatives undermine themselves by suggesting that this was something that didn't require a role for government. You know, when I was shadowing Renee, the social worker in the Netherlands, and we would encounter somebody on the street, and he would say, you've got to go to the shelter. We encountered a psychotic man. Psychosis, of course, being, it's not the same as psychopathy. Psychosis is when people are dreaming while they're awake and they're talking about aliens or the CIA or whatever. It's weird how similar the hallucinations are. UFOs. I said, what are you going to do with him, though? He said, well, he can go to shelter. I said, but he's psychotic. He said, well, then he may need to go into the hospital. And I was like, but do you have psychiatric beds at the hospital? Of course we do. Okay, but do you have rehab for him if he's a drug addict? Yes. Okay, in California or Texas or whatever, we say, do you have a psych bed for him? The answer is maybe, maybe not.
Right.
Do you have shelter for him? I don't know. And conservatives have been like, well, I don't know if we want to provide that. Well, here's the problem. Schizophrenics and drug addicts are not out there shopping for health insurance providers. And churches are not capable of providing good psychiatric treatment. Yeah. So I ended San Francisco by interviewing a number of, I think, forward-thinking conservatives. One of my favorite is Christopher Rufo, who is now very famous because he's the main antagonist to critical race theory. So I do think, and Manhattan Institute is very good on this. American Enterprise Institute, Sally Satel is very good on this, Raihan Salam. So I do think there is, you know, if this were a hero's journey, the hero that has to, I think, change in order to save the civilization is the conservative movement. If Republicans can offer this part of the social contract, psychiatric and addiction care, Cal Psych or Texas Psych or whatever it is, then I think you'll have a political advantage. But I think that conservatives have handicapped themselves by suggesting this could be done by the private sector.
Let's talk about housing first for a second. And Cleo and I had the out-of-body experience of appearing on Dr. Phil 3 weeks ago for a national debate on homelessness. Fantastic, worth watching. Go find it on YouTube. We did 2 shows back to back. Very, very useful debate. California has been the petri dish for housing first. You have literally made it part of your state kind of government system. This is the idea that you can't do anything with a homeless person without providing them housing. We took this position of treatment first. You're probably somewhere in the middle, shelter first plus treatment, whatever. It's not much difference, right? Yeah. But housing first has been an unmitigated failure almost everywhere it's been tried, at the national level and in the key cities. Talk about that from a California perspective. What have you all experienced? What is there to be learned about housing first? Because the only way we're going to win in cities on this issue is to literally delegitimize housing first as a credible approach.
I'm going to add to that because I have a question about that says that Dallas is adopting a housing first policy.
Oh boy.
And so your thoughts on about if you're aware of anything that's happening in Dallas and how that would work.
Well, I just had coffee with the mayor, and he had my book.
Did.
So let's hope this gets through. Yeah, no, I mean, and by the way, Matt, we're totally aligned. I mean, I sometimes say shelter first, treatment first, housing earned. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea would be that people come into shelter, but then there's triage.
Yes.
And you can identify as somebody, I mean, we're spitballing, but I would say about 10% of the unsheltered homeless population has a serious mental illness, not anxiety and depression spectrum that we all have, but schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, something serious. 75% are just addicts, which is in some ways great news because we know that's a much more treatable population, and then the other 15% is somewhere in between. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Housing First is one of the most dishonest social movements that's ever existed. San Francisco deconstructs it at length.
Yes.
The National Academies of Science put out a report in 2018, which showed that there's no evidence that Housing First works to resolve the underlying causes of homelessness. A big Harvard study over 12 years found that Housing First did not even house more people after 12 years than shelter. So yeah, absolutely. Housing should be earned. It's important when we say carrots and sticks, and I mentioned that my Dutch friend said the problem is that we got rid of the sticks. What also happens is that when you do that, you also get rid of the carrot. If you are giving, if you're treating housing as an entitlement and just giving housing to people, and they don't have to earn it, then there's no carrot for good behavior. What you want is to actually, at every moment in someone's personal plan, for there to be a stick and a carrot. A reward for getting off meth and fentanyl, pass the drug test, and you can go from the congregate shelter that's clean, basic, and safe, but maybe get your own room, because we know particularly stimulant addicts need some reward, but everybody needs a reward. Or there's a consequence. If you fail the drug test and you have your own room, you go back to congregate shelter. That's essential to helping people escape their addiction. And when you do Housing First, housing as an entitlement, you remove not just that stick, but also the carrot.
Several questions having to do with the crime aspect here, because you've got drug overdoses, you've got people who are trying to find money to buy drugs. We've had an increase in crime in the last few years. Are those two related? And if so, in San Francisco, you've had a huge increase in violent crime. Yeah. Are those related somehow, or do we know?
Oh yeah, we do know. I mean, in fact, when I told Renee, my Dutch social worker character, about the open drug scenes, he goes, you're probably seeing an increase in crime related to that. And I was like, yeah, we are. He's like, yeah, totally predictable. If you're not working, you're spending your entire day doing drugs in a tent on the street, you got to get you're stealing from the drugstore or breaking windows in cars and stealing. So we know that that's what goes on. By the way, when the New York Times totally ignored Apocalypse Never, they decided they needed to review San Francisco. They trashed it naturally. They lied about the book. They said that I had not interviewed any homeless people, which is kind of an amazing accusation, because anybody that reads the book will see the book is full of the voices of homeless people.
Not the least of which is Tom Wolfe, who is a really amazing guy.
Yeah. So I started posting on Twitter my interviews with people on the streets, and one of them, because laws are not being enforced in San Francisco, many laws, the folks on the street feel very comfortable telling you everything. So I have a bunch of videos of people on the street describing how they steal. I have a guy describing how he sold fentanyl to teenagers. So yeah, it's clearly part of that. But it's even worse in San Francisco because the district attorney is not enforcing so many laws. That's meant that many of the crimes that are being committed are also being committed by gangs and by people that are not just homeless addicts, but are involved in much worse criminal activities.
And you've talked primarily about large cities. Is there a small city problem with homelessness?
Yeah, I mean, there's a small city problem with addiction and untreated mental illness, since we can now let go of the word homeless, which is I think it's important to remember that a lot of the people in the open drug scenes have homes. And there's a lot of people that don't have homes that are not living in open drug scenes. So we can let go of the word homeless. But there's an addiction problem nationwide. It's with white people, black people, Latinos, it's everybody, it's different classes. It's, addiction doesn't discriminate. And we do see it in small towns. We see it in rural areas. We see in Sacramento, there's big encampments along the rivers. So it's everywhere. It's a national crisis. I think it needs to be dealt with the same way everywhere. It needs to be dealt with soon as well, because we are starting to get reports of teenagers going from experimenting with marijuana to smoking fentanyl. And that's not something that we had seen in the past. There was a much quicker move from marijuana now to fentanyl, and that's very scary when you consider that 0 people die of marijuana every year. and we had 110,000 or so deaths a year now from fentanyl and meth.
Let me ask you the question that I get more than any other, and I think I asked you this on our podcast interview as well, although I'll be curious to know if your answer's changed in the last 3 or 4 months. What explains why the left is so committed to a policy that's so clearly, evidently failing? My answer is corruption and money. That's what I've come to, having studied this for 3 years, but I imagine you have an answer that's a little deeper than that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly money is a part of it. So Housing First, is a way for Democratic politicians to make money. So if you're doing by the way, the average cost of a new homeless housing unit in California is between $700,000 and $900,000. So a lot of people are making money on that, and then they're donating to the politicians that are using taxpayer funding for that housing. So money is for sure part of it. But there's also a set of folks, the people that operate the supervised drug consumption site in San Francisco are true believers. And when you really figure out who they are and the way they believe, they're just real victim ideology dogmatists. They really believe, at the end of San Francisco, I asked whether or not this was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is when the parent poisons her child in order to get the satisfaction of taking care of her child. I didn't quite go that far, but I did say it's pathological altruism. These are people whose identities are in caring for the sick, and it's so pathological that they themselves become sick in their quest to care for sick people. I also describe in San Francisco, naturally this really offended a fair number of people, but I think it's absolutely accurate. San Francisco, the progressive radical left in San Francisco, including the Democratic Party, gave rise to Jim Jones. You may all remember Jim Jones. The People's Temple resulted in over 900 people dying in Guyana, drinking the Kool-Aid, cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. The Jim Jones, it's a huge blind spot for the radical left is compassion, caring for, the idea that caring for people could hurt people is something that conservatives are very familiar with. In some ways, that's perverse incentives is where conservatives start from. For progressives, it's like a huge blind spot. They can't imagine that would have the negative consequences that it's having, and they're offended by the idea that their supposedly good intentions to take care of somebody would end up hurting them.
Got some questions about businesses, because I know in California and Washington and Oregon, businesses have been that operate within the city have been pushing back business associations saying, you've got to get this under control or we're not going to be able to stay here. Businesses have been closing. Businesses have been moving here to Dallas or Texas, Austin. Where's the role in business for this? They should have the ability, I would think, to be able to press some of these things and get this, or maybe just step in and do it privately. I don't know, but what is the role in business?
Yeah, many are leaving. Many of the high-tech firms that have made San Francisco so wealthy are leaving. They're going to Miami. Others are staying and fighting, trying to support the moderates. But it's a very dynamic moment right now. I think it's fair to say, half of Californians surveyed say they're considering moving out of state. And that's all of Californians. Same thing in the Bay Area.
I think the other half have already moved.
Yeah. So, but right now. I was not going to run if I didn't feel like I had support from people that could support my run. But there's also people who are deciding whether to support me based on whether or not they think I can succeed. So your question it's a very active question right now. I think a similar thing is probably happening in Austin, though more dramatically, I think, in San Francisco and California.
We probably have time for one more question. Do you want to do it?
Yeah, sure. Let's change slightly, and let's ask about public education briefly, because I know a lot of people out here care about this, and these issues are all connected in some way. But one person out here wanted to ask, should we save public education? And is it savable? Is it worth saving? How do we save it?
And can you use public education to address some of the problems that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. My parents, I mentioned I have 4 parents, and 2 are psychotherapists, psychologists, 2 are public school teachers. My mom was a union rep. I believe in great teachers. but nobody hates a bad teacher more than a good teacher.
Yep.
By the way, when I started interviewing police officers, they say the same thing.
Exactly.
So I think it's fair to say that the mood on this issue has shifted significantly during COVID. My daughter was kept at home for far too long, required to wear a mask for far too long. Parents are fed up with we've lost sight of the fact that schools are supposed to be for kids. Somehow people got in their mind that the schools were for the adults. So look, we have a good solution to this, which is that parents should have more choice about where they get to send their kids to school. I mean, this is not complicated. So there needs to be some standards. Kids, you shouldn't be able to go to any school. And I worry about the kids whose parents are not on the ball. I worry about the kids, because to move your kids around require parents that are really assertive. Parents whose kids aren't assertive, I worry about those kids. They deserve a good education too. But I do think we're coming back to a place where we're going to see greater demand for school choice.
And I think you had 3 people on your school board in San Francisco just recently recalled because of some things they did.
By more than 70%. In San Francisco,
70%.
I think 10% of San Franciscans voted for Trump or something. So, so those are a fair number of progressives and Democrats.
And you're headed towards potentially recalling your DA on June 7th, as is expected. Maybe one last thing, positive note. I mean, you talked about sort of a dark view and feeling like civilization's at risk, and I think many of us out here sympathize with that feeling.
Yeah.
But you're obviously running a pretty big campaign, something you probably never thought you'd ever do. You must have some hope. What positive hope can you offer to people here that taking our cities back, taking our country back, saving our communities is doable?
Well, I think so. I mean, I feel the mood shifting in California. I think that it's easy to be deceived because the news media are so biased at this point, and what you see on Twitter is so biased that I think it's easy to overlook the fact that I think the majority of people, they don't want to see the destruction of our cities. They don't want to see the destruction of girls' sports. They don't want to see the destruction of our schools. Most people want civilization. So I think that gives me hope. I think that, the conservatives are changing too, right? Republicans are changing too. And you can see it with some of the changes that Trump made in terms of opposing foreign intervention, not trying to undermine entitlements, Social Security and Medicare. My view is if you could add in, psychiatric and addiction care, you'd have a very competitive offering for what Democrats have. So, we do have this system we have is amazing. I mean, the Federalist system allows for people to compare systems between states. So, yeah, I mean, California could continue to spiral down, or I could be elected governor.
Join me in thanking Michael. All right, remember, Michael has to head out to meet with the Sumner scholar, so don't waylay him because he's got another appointment to go. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, guys.